This idea for a quilt has been sitting on the back of my mind for a really long time. It's really something that I have been thinking through for a while and wanting to work on. I have slowly been working through different ideas that I've had to make this quilt come together and work. So hopefully, I finally have a lot of it together, but it might be kind of a work in progress because I decided I just need to go for it if I ever want to get this project made. I have been slowly collecting components for this project. Some of the fabric that I'm using, I just recently purchased because I've been waiting a while and looking around trying to find the perfect fabric for this idea. I really want this quilt to sort of look like a collage. What the idea is for it to kind of look like a page from a junk journal. I really love seeing different ideas for junk journals on different social media sites like Pinterest and TikTok. I love the way they look, but I honestly don't have time to start a junk journal. So I thought, why not make my quilt kind of look like a page from a junk journal? I am really so excited about this project and I hope that you enjoy it too. All right, so let me start with showing you the fabric I'm using for the project, and then I'll show you some of the other things that I'll be using to make this quilt come together. All right, so here is the bundle of fabric that I purchased for this quilt. And I purchased this fabric from quiltingcat.com. This is 12 plus yards of fabric and it is purchased as a bundle. And I got it for a great deal. I only paid $60 for this bundle of fabric. All right, so there are all the fabrics in the kit. They are so beautiful, and I'm honestly so excited to see this quilt come together. To me, it really does have a vintage feel to it. I'm really looking forward to bringing this all together. So there are a few other things that I gathered for this project to make it look like I am envisioning. And one of those items is doilies. I have been collecting these from antique shops in my area, and I'm really excited to incorporate them into this quilt. So here are some of the doilies that I'm going to be using in this project. I really love doilies and all the different designs that they come in. They're all so different sizes, different styles, and I really love them and have been wanting to work them into a quilt for a while. So I'm really hoping adding the doilies in will give this the look that I am looking for on this quilt. One of the other tools I'm going to be using in this project is a Dresden template. So this template is going to help me make the petals on a Dresden plate. Now, I received this template in one of my Open Gate quilt boxes. I will link to this tool in the description of this video if it's something you think that might help you along the way in this project. So now that we've gone through everything I'm going to be using for this project, you might have noticed me talking about the Dresden petal template. And that might have clued you in that we'll probably be making this into a Dresden quilt. And you will be right on that guess. Now, one thing I really want you to take note of is that this is not going to be like a traditional Dresden plate quilt because I want it to look like kind of a page from a junk journal or a collage. It is going to be assembled in a completely different way than this quilt would traditionally be assembled. So please keep that in mind. I do think it's going to be a lot of fun and hopefully give you some ideas on how to think outside the box when you are making a quilt. All right, so I am going to start getting all of my fabric starched. And after I get it really soaked with the starch, I'm going to let it dry some and then I'll be pressing the fabric. After I get it pressed, I'm going to be cutting out the petals for this quilt, as well as getting the blocks for the back of the quilt cut too. Now, I'm not going to sit here and go through all of the cut sizes and all of that for this quilt. What I will do is I'll put them up on the screen here so that you can take a screenshot of it, or you can go down to the description of this video and find all of the dimensions there. I feel like that will probably really help you for this quilt. Now, when I choose all my fabrics that I am going to be using for this quilt, because I don't think I will be needing all of the fabric here, when I choose that fabric, I'll try to note down how much I'm going to be needing for all of it, but it might not be completely accurate because this is going to be a little bit of a scrappy design. However, I will do my best to make sure that you have all of the cut requirements you'll need and hopefully a good idea of how much fabric you'll need. All right, so let's get this quilt going. All right, so I have all of my fabric cut for the project. I have all of my background squares. These are 18.5 by 18.5 inch squares. And I have 9 cut for the quilt top. So here are all my petals cut for the quilt top. There are a ton of them, and I have them all paired together how I want to piece the Dresdens. Each of the plates are just going to have 2 colors alternating around it, and I've paired all those colors together so I can keep them together and remember how I had them combined. So since I want these to be paired together very specifically, I'm going to chain piece them. When I chain piece them, they'll all be hooked together, and I won't snip the threads until I get to the end of the sets being sewn together. That way I can keep them all together and nice and organized, so I sew them together as I intended. So to sew these together, it's actually quite simple. You are just going to fold them right sides together, and you can see I have the wider edge here, and then the smaller edge is at the bottom. We're not going to sew the bottom edge right now. So we're just going to fold these right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam along here. So I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and the end each time I sew. And then I'm going to clip the corner that's by the fold just a little bit there. I'm not going to go through the threads or anything. And in my Dresden template package, I got this turning tool here that is very helpful for making the petals. So I'm going to turn it, and I can use the tool here to really poke out that point really nicely. Now, when I'm working on these, I like to press this seam inside here open, but you can press it to the side if you would like as well. So, and just like that, the petal is finished. I do like to press these seams as well, and that'll keep it nice and flat and crisp and ready for sewing. So for each plate, you'll need 20 of these petals. And like I said, for the top of the quilt, I'm going to alternate between 2 colors. So like I said before, I'm going to chain piece these together in sets because I think it'll make it a lot easier. So I just put these right sides together and sew that 1/4 inch seam. So I'm gonna back stitch at the beginning of the end. That's not something I normally do while I am piecing. However, here, because we're going to be flipping these and manipulating them a lot, pushing out seams, you really want to make sure it's nice and secure. So here I am starting the next one. I'm not clipping any threads. And I'll just sew all 20 of these together and then cut the threads at the end of that and start another batch for another plate. All right, so then when I get to the end, I'm just going to clip the threads, and then I have my long chain of petals all sewn together and they're nice and organized. So I'm going to set these to the side and get the rest of mine sewn together. All right, so I have my petals sewn, and I went ahead and clipped all of them together that go to one plate just to keep them all organized. So now I'm going to start sewing them together to create the Dresden plate. So to do that, I'm going to make sure that I alternate, but I have here one of my darker colors and one of my lighter background, and I'm going to put them right sides together, and then I will sew a 1/4 inch seam. So just like before, I'm going to back stitch at the beginning of the end because I want these to hold together really well before I get to where I can applique them in place onto the background of the quilt. So I have my first seam sewn, and that is how it looks. And so I'll just keep alternating the petals. I'm just going to put them right sides together, making sure I go back and forth between a light and a darker petal. And I'll just keep working in that manner until I have all 20 of them sewn together, creating a circle. All right, so normally with a Dresden plate quilt, you'll have your block that your Dresden plate is going to be attached to, and you'll normally do that before you piece the quilt top together. For this quilt, I'm going to piece the blocks together first, and you'll understand why when I start laying everything out. So to piece the quilt top together, it's going to be very, very simple. I'm just going to sew 3 of these blocks together. So I'll lay them down right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam. And once I get 3 blocks in each row, I will sew those rows together. So you'll end up with a 3 by 3 block quilt top. So kind of like a very big oversized 9 patch. All right, so as I said, this is very much going to be a work in progress quilt that will likely change as I go. And I think that's okay because I really want this, like I said, to look like a page from a junk journal and be very much have a collage feel to it. Once I pieced this 9 patch background, I realized that my Dresden plate doesn't quite fit in the squares as I hoped. I should have gone a little larger to probably a 20-inch square rather than an 18.5-inch square. So keep that in mind if you don't want to do what I'm going to do next on yours. What I decided to do was pull some fabric from my stash, and I had this gorgeous like newsprint fabric that I thought would work great in this quilt. So pretty. Now, what I did was I cut it into strips and I pieced strips together to be long enough to work on my quilt. And I did some 3-inch strips and some 1.5-inch strips. And what I'm going to do is add these going horizontally and diagonally across my quilt to add some more width and length to it. And I really think it's going to add a nice scrappy background on this quilt to really help it actually end up looking exactly like I was hoping it would look in the end. So I'll show you how I'm going to do that and how I'm going to make it work. All right, so here is the top of my quilt, and this is the large 18-inch square. Now what I'm going to do is line up my ruler on the 2-inch line, and then I'm going to cut a strip across here. I do have this folded in half just so I can cut a little more quickly, and I tried to line up the seam the best I could to be able to do that. So I'm going to cut across here 2 inches up from the seam. Now my ruler didn't quite extend across, so what I'm going to do is line up on the seam over here again and cut across again. All right, so now I have a slit separating the top of my quilt and the bottom of my quilt. So what I'll be doing is putting one of my small 1.5-inch strips across here. So I'll sew that in place. After I get that in place, I'm going to cut another slit below this line here, and I'm going to cut that 3 inches away. So 2 and then 3. So I'm going to get that cut. I'm going to get this piece, that cut, and it all sewed together, and I'll show you what it looks like so far after that. All right, so here are the slits on the first side put in, and I think the strips are really going to add some fun interest to the back of this quilt and help it really look like a collage. So I'm going to do that same thing along each side. So It's going to go along here, along that seam, then along this seam, and then along the seam here. So it's going to kind of be an inner border type thing around the entire quilt. So I'll show you what it looks like once I get all of those strips put in along the outer seams of the quilt. So hopefully here you can see those slits a little bit better. Here's that thinner strip, that's that 1.5-inch strip. And then where we cut the 2-inch strip away from the seam, we cut 3 inches down, and this is that 3-inch strip here. So hopefully you can kind of see how that's all coming together. What I'm going to do now is work along this seam and do the same thing. So I'll cut that slit that's 2 inches up from the seam here and attach the strip through here again, and then cut 3 inches down and place that wider strip along here. And then I'll turn the quilt and do the same thing along this side and then along the other side. I'm so glad that I decided to work with this quilt as is instead of recutting my fabric, because I really think this is going to turn out really nice as is, rather than starting over with my original idea and cutting all the fabric again. All right, so after finishing up the background of the quilt and getting all of the Dresden plates sewn together, so I have all 9 of them sewn together for the quilt top. So after getting the background and the Dresdens all finished, I decided to go ahead and get the circles ready. These are going to go in the center of the Dresden plates. So to get the circles ready, I just used what I had in my quilt space that I knew would work for the center of the quilt, and I used that to trace out the circles on my fabric. So once I traced out the circles on the fabric, I went ahead and cut out the circles, and then I cut out a template out of cardstock that was a bit smaller than the circle. I wanted it about 1/4 of an inch space around the template and from between the template and the end of the fabric. So 1/4 inch so I could fold it over. You could just leave the circle's raw edge if you would like, but I wanted to make sure there wasn't any fraying because that was the look that I wanted. So to fold the fabric back and keep it nice and even, I used the template to iron over the edge. To get it to stay in place, I used my Easy Press pen from Acorn, and I also added a little bit of spray starch as well. Now, I ironed that over. You'll want to be really careful because it does get really hot. But for me, that was the fastest way to do it. You could also use some needle and thread to go around the template and hold it in place that way, cinch it all together. There's a couple different methods you could use to do the fold over applique, but this one works for me. So after I got all the circles ready, and then I have my Dresden plates all ready to go and the background, what I'm going to do now is start laying everything out and get a layout I like. So I'll lay the backing out somewhere and start laying out all of my doilies and my Dresdens and just try to get a really fun layout that I like, and then I'll start sewing it all in place. I think the sewing will probably take me a bit longer than everything else because I'm not that great at applique, and I'm going to have to go nice and slow to get everything nice and even. And I haven't sewn over the doilies yet, but I'm worried that it might be a little difficult and my presser foot might get stuck. So I'll let you know if I get any tips and tricks for sewing that easily. All right, I'm going to go start laying everything out. All right, so I finally have a layout for the quilt that I really like. And now I'm going to start sewing it all together. It's going to be pretty hard to keep everything on the quilt to get it um, attached before sewing. I'm going to use applique adhesive and different things like that to get it to stay in place while I applique everything on. There's no way I'm going to be able to take this up to my pressing station as is and get it all set in place. So what I'm going to do is stack the Dresdens in order and keep a photo on hand to refer to for the organization I like. And also to keep everything nice and straight, because right now I just kind of have it in a laid out way that isn't keeping the Dresden in a straight row. I'm going to fold the quilt in half in both directions and press it, and then take the ends and fold them into that middle fold and press again to get an idea of where each Dresden should be placed and how to keep it nice and straight and even. All right, so I'm going to start getting these Dresdens attached, and I think I'm going to sew them on one at a time along with the doily that is corresponding to each one. I think that will keep it a little more organized and easier for me. All right, so I have the first Dresden and the center of the Dresden, the circle, all attached to the background. It is the first Dresden in the top row, and I used some applique glue to attach it. I didn't want to use any like fusible stabilizers or anything just because I didn't want that extra weight. This is going to be a pretty weighty and bulky quilt after I get everything sewed on. So I just figured this would be the best route. I did set up my sewing machine for sewing this quilt. I'll show you a few things that I did. I put a smaller presser foot on here. This is an 1/8 inch foot in that so that I can get really close to the edge here and go around. I did raise my stitch length, and I'm going to put it about just under 3 on my machine, and then I raised my presser foot some so that I'm not distorting the fabric and all these layers as I sew around. So I'm going to get the Dresden sewed on first, and then I'm going to attach on the doily on top of it that corresponds with this plate. Now, I'm just going to sew around here and try to stay right at the edge, an 1/8 inch away from the edge, and then do the same on the circle here. So it's just going to be some slow sewing. It'll probably take me a while to get all of these attached on. So I'm going to leave my needle down when I get to the points and just pivot my fabric and then sew along the other side. I just am going to try to get right to 1/8 of an inch the edge and then sew along. It's kind of easier at these points because when I get the needle right at the seam, that's where I'm going to stop and then pivot. The points are a little bit higher. So the valleys to me are easier. The points are a little harder to judge where I am in relation to the edge if I'm 1/8 of an inch away. But so it's just going to be a lot of sewing here. Now I'm just doing a straight stitch. You could always sew these in place with a fancier stitch if you would like to. Um, that's just kind of preference, I feel like. I'm using a cream thread, and I'm doing that because that is going to match my doilies really well. And I want the design on the doilies to stand out more than the thread color I'm using. So since this is all on the top of the quilt, I want the thread to match. So I don't even have half of these done yet. So like I said, this is going to take a while. All right, so now I have the Dresden stitched in place, and now I'm going to stitch the center circle in place. This will serve two purposes. One, it'll secure the Dresden even more, and then it will also attach the circle on. I'm going to do this much the same way. I'm just going to go slowly around this circle and try to keep as even about 1/8 of an inch from the edge as I can. Again, I'm just doing a straight stitch around the edge. If you have a machine that does nice fancy stitches, it might be fun to use a different stitch. If I start to see the fabric bunch up, because it's not really easy doing these tighter circles on a sewing machine, I'll lift my foot, my presser foot with the needle down so I can pivot a little bit and try to keep this nice and even. Slow and steady is honestly the best way with any applique. Now see how I'm wanting to turn a little bit and the foot is holding the fabric in place, so you just have to raise the foot a little and shift it. When you raise the foot, make sure you're not still sewing, and make sure your needle is down or you'll lose your position. Some of these are going to be completely covered by a doily, so my stitches won't matter so much on them, but you still need to get this secured in place. And even though the doily is going to be on top of all this, this is hiding all of that inner rough edges of the Dresden. So I do still want to attach this circle, even though a doily is going to be covering most of it visually. All right, so I have one finished on here. I'm so excited that I'm getting some progress on this quilt. Now I'm going to grab the doily for this square and get it lined up nice. For that, I don't think the glue or any of that will work. I think I'm going to have to pin that in place the best I can. So hopefully I can get it to work really well. All right, so I have the doily pinned in place. I just placed pins around the edge, and when I get to them, I'll be pulling those out as I go. So my concern is with the presser foot that the kind of toes, if you will, of the presser foot might get caught on the strings of the doily. And because of the nature of the doily, you can also see that there are kind of ruffles throughout the edge. Some of them are much flatter than others that I have, but I need to make sure that I go very slow, keeping an eye that I'm not getting hooked on any of the threads here. And when I get to places where it's not laying flat, I'm going to need to kind of add some pleats in here to capture the edge of everything. I'm going to try to stay right along as close to the edge of this as I can to keep it tacked down. And when I go to quilt this quilt, my plan is to follow the circles here to kind of hold more of the doily down. So we'll see how that goes, because again, it is a concern when I'm quilting that I get stuck on some of these threads. So this is definitely a quilt that you're going to have some patience for if you want to do one similar, but I think the result in the end is going to be very, very worth it also. All right, so I'm going to go along the edge here and hope that it works as I'm hoping it does. I'm keeping the stitch length the same because I'm going to be adding a lot more stitching on here at some point as well later. And mainly right now, I just want the edge to be down and in place. So going along here, I'm not, this foot thankfully curves up a tad at the end here, if you can see it. So I may not have as much concern as I thought I did with the foot getting caught in some of these threads. But this seems to be working really well. And I'm really happy with my thread color choice because it doesn't look like it's going to stand out a lot here and take away from the beautiful design of this doily. The kind of pleating that I'm doing, however, is kind of taking away from the design there, but hopefully the focus stays on the center. And that shouldn't happen in too many areas. There's just a few that, but there's a lot of spaces where it lays really flat. And not all of my doilies that I found have as much ruffle as others, especially the small ones. Those will work really well on this. All right, so the first Dresden is done on this junk journal quilt, and I am in love with how it looks. So I'm going to move on to the next one, and this is going to kind of be the same process throughout the whole quilt. I'm going to fold this um, this edge down to the seam here, the seam that is the background color. I'm not folding down to any of the newsprint seams. And that'll help me find the center of this section so I can press it and know where the center of the block there is so I can have a reference point to line up my Dresden for this next one. So now I have a nice crease there. I'm going to grab the next block on that pile. I'm going to move the doily because we're going to do that later. And then what I do is just line up the circle of the Dresden so it kind of looks centered on my two crease lines for this block. After I've done that, I'm just going to go through the same process where I use my glue. This is just some Acorn precision piecing product. So before I kind of flip this whole thing over, I think I'm going to do it in sections this time because it kind of got a little messy, and just get a few sections tacked down and see if that works a little bit better this time. Because really, if I get a few good spots tacked down, I think it should hold enough since I'm piecing it right away. Or not piecing it, but since I'm stitching it right away. I don't need it to hold on for a long period since I'm just working one at a time. And if this all isn't perfectly lined up, it's going to be better than when I was just eyeballing it and laying it out. But if it's not all perfectly lined up, that's honestly fine for the look I'm going for because this is supposed to be kind of a scrappy um, journal feel to it or scrapbook feel. It's not supposed to be perfection. Actually, none of my quilts are supposed to be perfection. I like to have fun and I like to see the finished product, and I like this to be a fun, enjoyable process for me. Yeah, if this is holding, yes, that was much better than having it flipped the other way, get all the edges with glue, and then try to flip it over and line it up without glue getting everywhere. Put a little bit under here. Hopefully I have enough of this glue because this is gonna take a minute. This fabric is absolutely gorgeous for this whole idea. And I think if you go to the Quilting Cat's website, when I was looking on it before, she still has a few more of these kits. So if you're loving it too, go grab one before they are gone. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to go sew this in place just as before, right along the edge here, then right along the circle. And then I will use some pins to put this doily in the center, and it actually kind of lines up almost perfectly with that circle in the center. So this inner beautiful flower almost lines up right there. Wonder if I could save myself some time and no, I'm not going to. I want to make sure it's lined up nicely, but I'm so excited about this quilt. Let me know in the comments what you think and how it is coming together. All right, so this quilt is almost finished. I actually have it all basted together and even some quilting done on it. I did some simple straight stitch quilting down the seams here. just to make sure it's nice and stabilized, because this quilt is actually pretty heavy with all the Dresdens and the doilies on it. It weighs a lot, and I wanted to make sure I got some quilting done to really help stabilize it before I add some more quilting. So I'm going to get some more quilting added onto here, but I did want to tell you something I discovered about the doilies I was working with. I had a few places that I wanted to add some extra doilies, but I didn't have quite enough to get the look that I wanted on this quilt. So what I did was I cut one of my doilies up because it was very, very ruffled, and I didn't think it would work really well tacking it down the way I'd hoped. So I took off the outer edge of the doily and was able to have two blocks that look just like this on the quilt. There's one there, and then one down here at the opposite side. So this one has that same outer part of the doily around it. I don't recommend cutting doilies apart. The way they are hooked together, they don't hold very well, but I got a lot of stitches down where I brought the seam together, and I do think it will hold pretty well, but it isn't really ideal. Now, there is the inner part of this doily still left, and I'm hoping to add it to some accent pillows later. So here is the inner part of that doily, and you can see, even though I snipped away part of it, it is still holding together. You just don't want to pull it a lot until you get those stitches down to really help secure it again. A few other tips I have for you when working with doilies. If you remember, when I was stitching this first doily on, I was discussing a lot of the ruffles around the edge. Something I discovered as I was working on all of these different blocks was that you can iron the doilies. And so I kind of played around with that a little bit, and I got some of them pretty flat. This one over here had a lot of ruffles around the edge, and it still had some after I ironed it, but it really got it much flatter than it was before. So I wish I had discovered that with the first one, because I think this one turned out a lot better because of that extra ironing on them. So if you decide to make a quilt like this, keep that in mind. I think it will really help you a lot, especially if it is a doily that has been used a lot, maybe washed. I ironed it and kind of stretched it out a little bit, and that helped so much when working with the rest of the doilies on this project. This was so much fun that I decided I am going to use some of my extra leftover petals to make 2 accent pillows as well. I had so much fun. So stay tuned for next week's video where I share how to put together these accent pillows, because if you are loving this look but don't want to take on such a large project, that might be the perfect way to have fun making a quilt like this with doilies and the Dresden plate and not have to sew so many together. All right, so my junk journal quilt is completely finished. I am so excited about how it turned out. I love it. So just so you know, quilting this isn't very easy with the doilies on here. So I ended up having to change my plan a little bit, and I just quilted along a few of the petals here to finish off the quilt. I wasn't able to free motion quilt circles around it or anything like that. It just kept getting stuck on the threads. If you are more comfortable with free motion quilting, it may work better for you doing it. I am not that comfortable with it, so I scrapped the idea and did something that worked for me. And because there's so many interesting elements on this quilt, I felt like it was fine not doing a lot of fancy quilting. I just needed to make sure all the layers were nice and secure. I went ahead and bound the quilt as well, so it is completely finished, and I am loving how it turned out. I can't wait to get the accent pillows finished, and I'll be sharing that video with you all next week. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.